suggest we move on to the second presentation. So our second presenter is already visible, and starting the presentation. So the floor is yours, Sven.
Yeah, starting the recording is already done.
Yeah.
Warm welcome on my behalf, Sven Bienert. I have a chair at the University of Regensburg, so I'm like Gunther, one of these scientists claiming to understand everything. I've been heading the institute in Regensburg for quite a while. We are the largest real estate institute at the university in Europe. Been concentrating on sustainability for, I would say, the last 15 years of my career. There was quite a hype, as we all know, when the certification schemes like DGNB and others came up. Then there was sort of a bit of no reaction in the market, not the biggest interest, and now we call all this ESG, and it gets massive attention. We have already many years ago conducted or built a software on physical risk that we sold to the German government. You can actually get sort of hazard information for your physical risk of your property, including vulnerability and also an annual expected loss. Was quite a successful project. As I say, it was already a couple of years ago, and it was also a little bit still, so there was not much attention to this topic. And actually this year in Germany, as you know, like in many other places, we had these severe extreme weather events, and all of a sudden I was in all the big German newspapers, Handelsblatt, Deutsche, Süddeutsche, whatsoever. And this is, I think, to some extent typical for the industry and how we address climate risk. Some market participants seem to wait until they get affected themselves. I think we should be more proactive. That's at least my lesson learned, and I'm really happy that regarding this topic, there's at the moment a lot of attention. I know that Fabrizio is also in this webinar today. I think also was a speaker this morning, couldn't participate actually. With the technical expert group, we had long collaboration also with RICS. We made a webinar last week, 2 weeks ago, with Susanna Eickermann-Riepe, European board executive for RICS, and we had 450 participants just on transition risk in Germany. So this topic is really of high importance. I was at the Copenhagen conference of INREF just yesterday, and we had a full afternoon dedicated to transition risk and the tool CRREM, which I will talk about in the next 20 minutes or so. So the whole topic is really getting massive attention lately. I'm really thankful for that. And of course, regulation, as many speakers today illustrated, is pushing this agenda. But I guess also the awareness that we need to do something as an industry, as a society, is becoming more and more present and clear to everybody. So now I will be focusing on transition risk, which is one part of the climate risk story. We have physical risk and we have transition risk. I will talk about it in a minute. And Gunther, I think your introduction was a little bit framed like we talked before on financials, and now we are talking about properties a little bit, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, I will also talk about financials because giving the industry a financial implication, so putting a price tag on climate risk is really, really important. It's the main aspect to convince the industry, besides, of course, strict regulation. And we started this CRREM project on transition risk approximately 4 years ago already. We do H2020 projects, which actually was the initial funding for this project quite frequently. We are quite happy that we could get those projects frequently, and we had some that were a bit more and a bit less successful. but I have to say the attention that actually this project and topic received during the last year and also now after the funding of the EU expired is tremendous. It's overwhelming, and I think it's not clearly not because we did something extraordinary or so. I guess we did a good job, but it's really the topic, and the market is in need of tools, instruments, methods to actually track climate risk and put a price tag on that. And I fully agree with what has been just said, which is we need to more intensively focus on the carbon emissions. So actually, I know, Fabrizio, we were talking a long time when you were part of the technical expert group together with Ursula Hartenberger, and actually also our project, operational decarbonization and carbon intensities here, CRREM, was one of the recommendations also of the technical expert group that we are some sort of best practice, which is great. But in the end, the EU, the Commission is still sticking to these EPCs, which is good on one hand, but we already learned about some shortcomings there. And I fully agree that we should clearly focus on the KPI carbon intensity, because that's, of course, looking at the whole set of KPIs that you could think of when it comes to sustainability and ESG. I think carbon intensities are for sure the most important ones. Why is that the case now? Getting us all on the same page, and looking here maybe at this graph, you probably know that famous climate tracker graph that illustrates how far off we are when it comes to the Paris Accord. We are all clear, all the countries globally signed this international agreement that we would like to not exceed 1.5 degree warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And we are not on the right track, as we all know. COP has just been finished again last week with some good and also some not so nice results. So I guess, first of all, before we discuss transition risk, not just from an academic point of view, but also from a practical industries point of view, I think we need to be clear whether this is something that is relevant. Because if we are all in a Trump world where you can emit whatever you like, there are no restrictions, then of course we also have to come to the conclusion that of course transition risk is not relevant, because transition risk is the risk that in our case here, a property is falling short of the Paris-proof decarbonization requirements, let's put it that way. And of course, if you're not limited in terms of your emissions, if you think that we might actually not just fall short of the Paris Accord, but maybe dump it completely, then of course there's no need to act. And on the other hand, of course, if we are moving into a very extreme scenario with 3 or more degree warming, then the physical risk will increase significantly. So also from a strategic point of view, it is important to discuss and make up your mind whether you believe in more or less physical and transition risk. Well, my perception is clear. I think we will, if you look at the science and results that colleagues produced, it's clear that we will have more extreme weather events, so more physical risk in the future. Making sure that your properties are not vulnerable is important. And on the other hand, I think clearly also we need to be clear that there is going to be a whole lot of transition risk, because even during COVID, if you look at the projections of Carbon Disclosure Project and World Bank and others, even during COVID, a lot of countries, of course, intensified their ambition level on a national regulation basis with regard to carbon taxes, cap and trade systems, and so on. And the reason is because they are, of course, submitting, as you can see here, this green part, they are submitting more and more ambitious national determined contributions in order to fulfill their pledges, which is clearly needed. I mean, you cannot sign a 1.5 degree target and then say I'm walking away without contributing anything. So the ambition level is increasing. Will it be enough to meet 2 or 1.5 degree? I don't know, but I see that clearly the national determined contributions, so what the countries have delivered and will deliver in order to make sure that they are fulfilling their 1.5 pledge is definitely increasing. So there are more ambitious targets that will be submitted, and that means in turn that of course also national regulation will be intensified. We had one very prominent big residential property owner that was using our 1.5-degree Paris-proof decarbonization pathways. I will illustrate in a minute what we mean and what that is, but they were using that and they thought 2 or 3 years ago in a pilot project that those are nice, they are scientifically perfect, but the German regulation from their point of view was much less ambitious, and that was why they thought they could neglect and stop just with this pilot and not use our recommendations anymore. They came back this year saying, okay, we now see that the national regulation is actually increasing. It's going to be more ambitious. And now we are using your pathways again because we think that is the right way to be also on a property level Paris proof. And I was like, guys, what did you expect? I mean, if Germany, if the European Union, if all the nations that signed the Paris Accord would like to stick to these 1.5 degrees, they will eventually need to increase the ambition level of national regulation. And we had quite a few investors, asset managers, users of our tool and our resources that came back after a year claiming, okay, we now see that the national regulation is moving into the direction that you are suggesting. What do we have? We have a tool where users can actually input their consumption data, and the result is, in a nutshell, the carbon intensity of a certain property in terms of the operational carbon profile, and that will be benchmarked against the Paris-proof decarbonization trajectory. So basically, we are trying to put a price tag on carbon risk. We are trying to reduce uncertainty for investors. And what is more, and I think that was also the source of the great success of our initiative, was that we are and are aligned with a lot of international organizations addressing climate risk like TCFD, like SBTI, like GRESB, and many others I will touch upon in a minute. Moving from this Paris Accord and that everything is moving more and more into this direction, getting more and more ambitious, moving to a company level. And again, why should we think that carbon intensities of certain properties are relevant to us? Now, the reason is, of course, there might be a sort of carbon price in the future. And as I said before, if you look at the resources available, you will see that even during COVID, even during a very, complicated time for all markets globally, regulation increased into that direction. So they were, even during COVID, putting more pressure on the market. And I think that is a clear sign that politicians are willing to take that further step into the direction of decarbonization. And we've seen that the European carbon price actually hit a record high this year, was around 3, 4, 5, 6 euros for a long time, as you might know. Was a record high of 40 euros, and the projection is clear that it's going to be already, I think, 2030 beyond 140. Here in this projection, you see 2050. I think that is going to be way before that. So I think this is a very conservative view. And we have in Germany, but also in Austria now also the discussion, and in Germany already introduced the carbon price on real estate, which is starting with 25 euros and increasing very fast. You have, out of the 500 biggest companies globally, not just real estate, but all companies, you have already 50% that use internally carbon shadow price for their investment decisions. So carbon is relevant. To have a very decarbonized asset, no matter if it's real estate or other assets, it's on the positive side. If you have an asset that is, compared to your peers, very carbon intense in operations or with regard to embodied carbon, you might run into problems. So carbon is really a very important aspect. And for instance, since I'm focusing a lot on Germany and Austria, if you look at the German regulation, it says in the long-term renovation strategy, for instance, and we fully agree that carbon intensities should be a much more prominent part in regulation also going forward. I've been talking about transition risks. I already tried to define it a little bit. So let's just be precise and clear. What is transition risk for real estate? It means that actually if your property is using a whole lot of energy that is not decarbonized, if it has high energy intensities, if it has very high carbon intensities per square meter, then of course, compared to your peers, you are facing a lower market demand. It might even be the case that of course you're running into problems with regulation. We've seen markets where emission EPCs, energy certificates with G and H, you cannot rent them anymore. The European Commission is discussing this with an 8-year in advance scheme that they are going to forbid all the G and H properties to be rented out completely. So it's not just certain countries, it's in this case the whole European community. Of course, you're exposed to further regulation. Properties that have a high carbon intensity in Germany, they will pay higher prices with regard to the carbon tax. And then last not least, of course, on a company level more, I would say, you are exposed to reputational risks, because clearly being ESG positive, which means you're looking into the details of climate risk, try to reduce your consumption and so on, is also from an ESG company perspective relevant, because investors are more and more looking into these details. I'm on a supervisory board of a couple of companies, and I can tell you that for some of them, actually on the annual assembly, more investors ask about how is your ESG structure, how are you doing compared to your peers. There are very detailed questions around this, and if you don't want to be exposed to reputational risk and market positioning risks, you should address these topics. The carbon risk real estate monitor, which is my topic here mainly, is focusing on a tool and the pathways that I will show in a minute. And we have in Europe, I would say all the big institutional investors are already using the tool. We had for this tool just last month 2,000 downloads, which is, I would say, a lot, since we are not talking about some fancy app that some teenager might use. It's quite sophisticated tool that actually institutional investors and their ESG managers, asset managers, and so on would use. So it's a tool where you would expect just a certain part of the market is using. So very intensive downloads, very intensive use. We are now very active in the US with NAREIT, ULI Greenprint as our strategic partner. We have been doing with Measurable. You might know they just raised, I think, close to 40 million equity to work on this topic. We've just done a webinar with them. We are very active in Asia Pacific with the United Nations project we are running on transition risk at the moment. So a lot of activities there. Also UNREF, which is the sister organization of INREF in Europe, in Asia Pacific, doing a project with us. So a lot of interest in this tool and our resources, and many more interesting collaborations are underway. So what are we doing? We have actually calculated, downscaled with a very long methodology. You can have a look at our methodology document on our webpage, CRREM.eu and CRREM.org. We have downscaled the anthropogenic carbon budget to real estate in operation, and then allocated a fair share of that to certain countries and certain use types, because clearly a shopping center in Hong Kong, for instance, will not today, and also not in 2050, have the same consumption pattern like, I don't know, a single family house in Burkina Faso in Africa, clearly, because it's heterogeneous, and it will stay heterogeneous. And that's why the industry really liked this approach, because we are differentiating between different countries and different use types. So this is the sort of benchmark we produce for 1.5 and 2 degree for carbon intensities and kilowatt hours, because kilowatt hours is of course something that the market is working with. And then you input your property data. Our property data assessment is completely aligned with CRREM, by the way, who's our partner, but also with many other organizations like INREF and others, because clearly you don't want to gather the same data 5 times. And you can here benchmark your property against these decarbonization requirements. And you can see that over time, your property might be at the very beginning compliant with the fair share of the Paris remaining budget, but it will be stranded in over time. So until 2050, you will not be in line with the Paris-proof decarbonization requirements. So you should actually do some energetic retrofit. You should change the energy source. You should, wind down your energy consumption pattern somehow. There is a whole lot of math, of course, included in the tool and in the pathways. We are, for instance, including different climate scenarios, because of course, also without doing anything with regard to the property, the climate will change, and that will change your heating and cooling degree days. And that has been accounted for in the tool. You can either use that function or make your own assumptions regarding the climate projection. Then we do, also, of course, also integrate grid decarbonization according to the projections in the different markets. Clearly, I don't know, Austria has an emission factor for electricity of 0.25, Germany at the moment somewhere around 0.4, and that is decreasing over time because, of course, also the electric grid is decarbonizing, the energy sector is decarbonizing, and that's what we account for depending on the energy source you're using. So both things together are, of course, this carbon risk analysis, and of course, a closer look needs to be taken at that point in time where you are stranding. If you do carry out an energetic retrofit, you will be fine. You might, of course, trigger some embodied carbon. We outbalance that against the savings which you would expect in the future after that energetic retrofit. But then you might be aligned again in the best case. What is also important is, of course, here this red part, we call it excess emissions. So these are the emissions that go beyond a Paris-proof pathway. And if you put a price tag on the carbon emissions, as we discussed before, and calculate a present value, then of course you have sort of the maximum amount that you would be willing and might be sensible to spend for an energetic retrofit. And a lot of market participants say, yeah, but we don't have a carbon price in our regulation. And as I said before, it shows that over time, more and more countries are introducing carbon prices. I think you already discussed also today that the European Union is sort of taking out the real estate part, at least a bit, from the effort sharing decision, which we are using now for real estate with the EPCs, and wants to integrate real estate more intensively also in the emission trading structure. So it could be the case that a very optimized property is selling off carbon credits in the future, and a very lousy one with a high carbon and energy intensity needs to buy carbon credits. This is a real screenshot on the left-hand side from one of these graphs. There are a lot of analytics in the tool, but I'm just, for the sake of time, just focus on this one. We monitorize a transition risk. It's a key benefit. We are showing whether you are Paris aligned or not. We have different use types and countries, 44 countries, and all the relevant use types that you could think of, except data centers. We might consider those in the future. We have annual updates of the pathways because clearly science is progressing, and of course, as new data comes in, we need to revise that. There's a very solid downscaling methodology, for instance, JPIF, which is the biggest pension fund in Japan. They considered 1.5 years ago to use our decarbonization pathways and resources, and they started a 3 months period where they hired a consultant to do all these tiny little checks on what we've what we have derived. And of course, coming from Austria, Germany, we were quite afraid that we got something wrong with regard to the Japanese data, but luckily everything was sort of signed off. So just an example that actually we did do a massive consultation internationally, and of course things are changing over time, but you can be sure that the underlying methodology and data is the most reliable one that you could gather. And a lot of alliances. I don't know if you talked about PCAF, for instance. I haven't thought about that a year ago. I thought the most pressure would come from the equity side, but actually now you also have initiatives like PCAF that are looking on financed emissions. So clearly, if you want to use your property as a collateral in the future, it will be equally important not just to show your financial creditworthiness at the bank, but also to illustrate that you have a favorable carbon footprint of your property. Interesting, a couple hundred banks are the signatories of PCAF, and they are progressing fast using our resources for real estate. Here you can see the downscaling is a sectoral decarbonization approach aligned with SBTi. On the left-hand side for different countries, on the right-hand side for different use types, in that case, the UK, just for your illustration. We are looking at the whole building. So important to mention, always complicated. We had 2 years ago a lot of discussion in Europe. Why should we focus on the whole building? We are just the investor. We are just responsible for the common space. Yes, but you have erected the hardware, the property. And of course, we can only optimize the whole property. All relevant institutions, whether it's INREF, whether it's EPRA, whether it's SBTi, GRESB, they are all looking at the whole property. So regardless if you think that is fair or not fair from a landlord's perspective, it's common sense in the marketplace. We have the same discussions, by the way, now in America and also in Asia. Same problems. Getting their hands on tenant data is complicated for most market participants, but with smart metering and green leases and so on, it's progressing. And of course, clearly, if you don't have full data coverage, also our software is in the position and is able to run these data gaps if there are any, and extrapolate the data you have used. Then, of course, the energy consumption is converted into carbon emissions and carbon equivalents, as you can see here. And that is also something that is important. We have just concluded a project for a very, very big retail property owner in Europe with more than 500 stores. And I can tell you that the refrigerant losses, the F gases, are responsible for about 20 to 30% of the overall carbon equivalent footprint of the property. And this is something that most market participants are not tracking yet. So for all of us, very important, and we have some research also on that undergoing with my PhDs, looking at the F gases and tracking those is very, very important, because otherwise we should not talk about carbon CO2 equivalents. We should then just talk about CO2. But as you know, the targets are set and include also other greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide. Here you can see the retrofit measure. But of course, clearly energetic retrofit is just one step, just one option to get to net zero. There are other opportunities you might consider. Of course, it's not just the consumption pattern of the energy that needs to be wound down, but also the decarbonization of the resources you are using as energy for energy. And of course, clearly in introducing more renewables on site is a very important step. Of course, not feasible for all properties, clearly, but for logistics, for a lot of retail premises, and of course, for some office premises, there are a lot of options to increase renewable energy on-site production. Consumer behavior, there is a huge discrepancy. You've been talking about the EPCs already, but also there's a huge discrepancy between demand and actual consumption for most properties. So we should more intensively focus on the real consumption, because that might be 20 to 30% higher than the calculated demands. And then, of course, building automation, if you don't want to summarize that under energetic retrofit and technical equipment, it's from my point of view some different or additional aspect, because there are a lot of good prop tech solutions that offer, just in terms of the building automation, really good solutions to reduce consumption. And then, of course, the last step should just be green carbon credits or green electricity or green energy that you are procuring. That should really be the last option that you would consider as a landlord, as an owner. And you should work on efficiency first, of course, clearly, as the first steps. What were the main challenges? And here on the right-hand side, you can see just one picture of some project we ran just with very, very prominent market participants, where you expect everything is already in place. The colleague who actually prepared this slide just had 3 different stages: green, yellow, and red. And I said, please include another one to make sure that the companies that we analyzed do not feel offended or put in a bad light. But actually, you could also say that there was, for some parts, really poor results, and that is clearly a call for more action within our industry. Data coverage, you were talking about it before. And of course, certified data, whether it's DGNB or others, is important, because it should not just be self-declared, right? It should be certified data, because it makes a difference if you just collect the data for common space and then put it into a tool like ours and claim to have full data coverage, then your property looks very good. It looks, in terms of the output, very decarbonized. But of course, it's the same problem as usual: garbage in, garbage out. So make sure you have certified and good quality data. Most market participants do not track refrigerant losses. Very important from my point of view. There are F-gas exit strategies in place, and I know there are, of course, also a lot of restrictions in the European Union to use certain F-gases, but still, that needs to be looked closer. Some market participants, really surprising, some didn't even have occupancy data, clear view on the occupancy. Then, of course, getting their hands on tenant data, tenant consumption data, for some really a challenge. They were aware of the kilowatt hours that were consumed in a property, but couldn't allocate that in some cases to the energy sources. And as I said before, it clearly makes a difference if you have 1 kilowatt hour from renewables, or if that was from, I don't know, oil burned on site, which is, of course, emitting a lot of carbon. Data on renewables, or generally renewables problem, and then on user-defined information. I haven't showed you details of the tool. Clearly, there are, besides the default data that we do offer our users, there is a lot of information that could be also changed. If you have, for instance, if you're using district heating, you shouldn't use the default function in our tool. You should use the emission factor for your district heating. That could be gathered from the energy provider, of course. And a lot of market participants have no clue actually that these aspects are relevant if you really want to work on transition risk and climate risk. So in a nutshell, data availability and quality data is still a challenge in our industry. And I have to be honest, I feel that a lot of market participants, CEOs and managing directors are signing now net zero targets and claiming that they have net zero targets, but actually the management of tracking and controlling that these targets are actually achieved, and the measures that need to be taken, are still lagging behind to some extent. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, not just the European Union, but also Laudes Foundation, APG, Norges, PGGM, and some international other organizations that were also contributing a lot, like RESP, JPIF, and Cambridge Ivanhoe. thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you, Sven. I want to open it up to the audience for questions.
So there was, I don't know if you see the questions before from does the tool encourage decreasing energy consumption as well as promoting switching to renewable energy? Yeah, of course, both. But of course, the point is that some market participants, and I feel that is some excuse to do greenwashing, are claiming, okay, if we need to decarbonize, we just switch to electricity. And since the energy sector needs to decarbonize until 2050, we will be fine. Of course, that is right to some extent, but clearly you should, of course, switch the energy source to renewables, not just from the grid, but also other renewables. And you should also work, of course, on your energy intensity, so reduce consumption. So we are actually supporting both.
Yeah, Sven, would you name and shame if people do greenwashing?
No, we don't. I mean, we are offering our resources for free. And of course, we don't do any kind of certification. We will have some stricter governance soon, because we were coming from this EU project and grow and grew. And so now we need a more sophisticated governance. So it will be made clearer whether you are referring in the right way to the CRREM pathways or not. But the whole certification will be up to actually SBTi in terms of verification of targets at least. Yeah. But we are putting at the moment the good practices in the window, and we are not pointing at the ones that might need to work harder on what they are claiming to achieve.
But aren't you afraid that people might misuse the CRREM tool in the wrong way?
There is actually at the moment this MOU with SBTi underway. So the CRREM pathways which are SBTi aligned will just be the 1.5 degree ones. So at the moment we have 1.5 and 2 degree. We might keep the 2 degree, but only the 1.5 degree. So the very high ambition will be SBTi aligned. And clearly there might be users that claim that they have already achieved something, but they didn't. We haven't tracked that or tried to point our finger at some market participants. We are now also putting together, because we have been approached by MSCI, by many organizations that are using the CRREM resources for their analytics and derived products, and we are now drafting license agreements to ensure that they are using also our resources in the right way.
Right, thank you.
Mark.
Oh, hi. Sorry, Mark is my husband, if everyone's wondering why Mark has a female voice.
Well, that's what I see here.
Sven, thank you so much. Still getting my head around the tool, but is there, and you might have already answered this, but I didn't hear it, is there, I've heard rumors that embodied carbon will come into the tool soon. Is there a target launch date for this? Because clearly there's, we can't just focus on operational carbon.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point. I mean, first of all, where is embodied carbon relevant? It's relevant in new construction, which is, I think, one part, and 80% of the properties that will be there in 2050 are already built today. So we are looking at the operational carbon and try to wind down that. And for us, embodied carbon is just relevant when it comes to the trade-off between energetic retrofits and the savings afterwards. And we already do account for that embodied carbon in our tool, because there need to be a positive payoff of that. And there is also funded by Laudes Foundation, another organization called Rambo. They are running a project on embodied carbon, and they will put general limits on embodied carbon. But our intention is not to include embodied carbon, because the embodied carbon in the existing structure are if you match that with the remaining carbon budget of us as a society, it's like sunk costs. It's the carbon that was emitted in the past. So looking into the future, we have a remaining carbon budget, and for the properties standing, that will only be reduced by their operational carbon footprint and of course by their retrofits, and both parts are included in what we are doing.
Okay, thank you. I won't ask another follow-up question. Thank you.
Please do, if you like.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it's just really trying to encourage retrofitting then, right? Rather than knocking down a building and building a brand new one. And I guess maybe that just comes into the price of carbon that you mentioned at the start. Just people need to be incentivized somehow to retrofit, and obviously retrofitting is harder to reach net zero carbon targets than building a new building from scratch. So it's kind of just, yeah, bringing those two together.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it wasn't really a question, but I would really agree with what you are saying, because I mean, building a new building is, depending on what you're doing, but state of the art at the moment, it's maybe 1,000 kilograms CO2 per square meter. And if you look at operational carbon footprints, it's about 20 to 30 years of the property's life. So if you can recycle 80% of the existing structure, keep that, of course, that makes much more sense than just tearing down all the existing properties and building a nice LEED Gold certified new one, because that comes along with a lot of embodied carbon. And so we really need to closely look at that trade-off and make sure we take the right decisions going forward.
Thank you.
That would also, if I may ask this question, that would also mean that in the certification schemes, we would need to concentrate more on existing buildings and put more emphasis on that, because when you get this nice certification for the new building, there is an incentive to knock down the old building, but of course, it doesn't make sense, neither economically really, and also not from an energy point of view.
Yeah, Gunther, I couldn't agree more. I mean, like you, yeah. I've been also supporting, of course, the various certification schemes. We are working closely with Christine Lemaitre in Germany, and of course also with LEED and so on. So it's generally, I support certification, but clearly we need to focus more intensively on the existing building stock, so have things like REN and in use and so on. And of course, also we need to get away. And I think there are a lot of certification schemes are struggling at the moment with what is the relevance, right? Because certification that has been done 10 years ago, LEED Gold or so, they are not taxonomy compliant, they are not Paris proof, they are nothing. So what's the benefit, right? I mean, and I think we need to really track on an ongoing basis what are the targets that we need to achieve for that building, and how did we proceed, or is there any success already? And I think with just a one-off certification, you will not see that, right?
Sima.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gunther. Maybe I can just also add on here. Yes, we obviously have a lot of certification in new construction where it's on focus, where certification is used as a planning and optimization tool, but we shouldn't forget that there are also other certification schemes. We at the DGNB have the Buildings in Use scheme, which is not, which actually can be used as an optimization tool to transform an existing building, where it's about setting up a climate action roadmap and about monitoring and monitoring your operation. And you can use that when maybe if you're starting off in your existing building and discover that you're not taxonomy compliant, for example, then you can use the existing buildings or the building and use scheme to go on the pathway to becoming taxonomy aligned, or even to reduce your carbon emissions. So I think we need to, obviously, I think in the last 10 years, the main focus in certification schemes was in new construction, but at least for the DGNB, we are also we also have solutions for existing building stocks and how to set up a climate action roadmap.
Seema, I think we are all clear on that, and I think besides DGNB, BREEAM is the most widely used certification scheme for existing properties. I just fear that, you know, if you look at the take up of DGNB and also other certification schemes, we are talking about 1% new construction. And I think out of that 1%, not even 1% of that 1% is certified. So we need to look at the whole market and of course, not the top notch, not the skyscraper 185 in Frankfurt downtown. That is good if we can put that on the front page and say these market participants are front runners, but we need to think of tools and methods and instruments that could really move the whole market. And I think that is ongoing controlling and optimization products.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would like to end with a somewhat more optimistic perspective. I think that also in existing buildings, certifications have moved something in the last 10, 15, 20 years. So when I look at the Austrian situation, it's completely different nowadays than in 2009 when we proposed that for the first time. At that time, one of the CEOs of a big developing company told me, no one will pay me €1 more for a certified building. And that is history. That is, we are past that. And I think we need to move along. And the industry needs to move along. And we have some guidelines. And we need to pick that up and work on that. Well, I would like to thank all the presenters and also Dilek for chairing the first session, and thanks to everyone. Dilek, do you want to say a few final words?
Yeah, thank you, Günther. Thank you so much, everybody, just listening, joining us today. I just want to say we hope to see you face to face in the next meetings, because now we have a bit of Zoom fatigue. We know. Actually, I see some names. We already know each other, but also I see some new names joining to us today, which is really nice. I guess which is one benefit of being online. We can have a chance to just extend our network and then reach out a wider audience, which is really nice and then really, really insightful for the next editions. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Following up on that, we have a webpage, www.eres.org. We have a newsletter. We have some activities on social media, so please stay in touch with us. And we definitely have interesting industry seminars, education seminars, and most importantly, our annual conference with really exciting presentations and discussions. So I hope to see at least some of you in the future at these events, and would like to thank you and close it with that. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice weekend.